This is a presentation by Rita Arazi and Katie DeFonso. For providing unique insight into the family of the Tudor king Henry VIII, we owe much to the work of the artist Hans Holbein the Younger, who served as the court painter for Henry beginning in the early 1530s. Holbein was born in the winter of 1497 in Augsburg, Germany, to Hans Holbein the Elder. In 1515, he went to Basel in Switzerland and, after many years of apprenticeship, traveled to England in search of a higher position, possibly court painter, with the recommendation of Desiderius Erasmus, written for Thomas More. It is presumed that in 1533 he began to design jewelry for Anne Boleyn at the request of Henry VIII. Holbein most likely died of the plague around 1543, and was interred in a church on Leadenhall Street in London. Among the artists who influenced Holbein was the great Northern Renaissance painter Albert Dürer. Holbein did not begin his career focused on portraiture. Yet as the court painter for Henry VIII, portraits would become an area of expertise. The faces of those individuals whose portraits he painted were often defined with only a few lines, and he generally started to complete his paintings only after having made preliminary drawings. Despite the naturalism that characterizes Holbein's work, he was certainly capable of distorting perspective slightly in order to produce his intended effect. The minimalistic backgrounds in many of Holbein's portraits convey a sense of timelessness. The words of Nicholas Bourbon are telling. You wish to see pictures that perfectly resemble life? Behold this work by Holbein's noble hand. Holbein created many portraits of Henry VIII over his 37-year reign, but arguably the two most important paintings are the ones from 1537 and 1540. The one from 1537 was part of the mural at Whitehall Palace, and the later portrait was painted 7 years before Henry's death in 1547. The famous full-length portrait from Whitehall does not exist anymore, but due to Remigius von Lamputt's faithful copy of it before it was destroyed by a fire in 1698, we know what the mural would have looked like. The mural featured Henry on the front left as well as his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and his third wife, Jane Seymour. This was one of the first instances where a royal portrait was used as propaganda in order to continuously affirm Henry's power and sovereignty. The figure of Henry VIII in the mural was much copied in the 16th century and reproduced so often that it finally acquired the status of a symbol. This is the iconic image of the king striking an aggressively proud, bold-legged stance. Henry's plan of promoting himself as an authoritative and powerful ruler was so successful that popular perceptions of Henry's reign were decidedly influenced by this one portrait, where he is embodying those characteristics. One of the prominent details in the original mural was an inscription consisting of couplets written by Henry's Latin secretary, Richard Morrison, that had an overpowering anti-papal theme, in line with Henry's idea of royal supremacy and authority over the Church of England. Sam Brooke has observed that the Latin inscription purposefully likened Henry to an imperial conqueror, triumphator, a point reinforced visually by the imperial Roman bust that appears in the roundel above the base of the column. The historical context in which this mural was created may shed further light on Henry's imposing representation. The charged political atmosphere at court in 1537 explains both the aggressive tone of the inscription and the deliberately intimidating, combative nature of the king's confrontational pose in Holbein's mural. The rebellions in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, and the echoes of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, undermine Henry's central authority by seeking to restore the dissolved monasteries and the Pope's supremacy in the English Church. This authoritative image and representation of his kingship is one of Henry's responses to those threats to his realm's unity. The second portrait of Henry is the last one painted by Holbein in 1540, 7 years before Henry's death. Again, Henry is shown to be physically imposing and is represented as a figure of power and authority. However, this representation of Henry is not entirely accurate. We know he was suffering from multiple physical ailments, such as an infection in his leg, obesity, and gout. In the portrait, however, he has a poised and confrontational stance that is reminiscent of the portrait from 1537. It is likely that Henry would continue to depict himself in this manner in order to maintain his image of authority, despite facing troublesome issues that would affect the future and security of his realm, such as succession, possible conflicts with Catholic Spain, and the threat of foreign authority seeping into England. We now turn to Holbein's portrait of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who he married in 1536. This portrait, which is in Vienna, differs slightly from a very similar portrait in The Hague that is now believed to have been made by an artist close to Holbein a few years later. Most notably, this portrait is 3/4 length and does not merely depict Jane from the waist up. It is possible that the many jewels and large sleeves were an attempt to conceal imperfections in Jane's figure. However, it should also be pointed out that Jane was likely pregnant at the time when this portrait was made. Regardless of whether or not the jewels and clothing were meant to serve this purpose, Henry was sincerely devoted to the mother of his only son, and the pendant that she wears, which came from Henry's collection, is evidence of this. First a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, one might notice a sense of servitude in this portrait that is conveyed through Jane's serious expression and clasped hands, fitting for a woman whose motto was bound to obey and serve. The tightly pursed lips are those of a woman who is prevented from taking an active role in her husband's world of politics, and expected to keep her opinions largely to herself. Holbein's portrait faithfully reflects Jane's preference for English-style clothing and the gabled hood, thereby distinguishing her from Anne, who had favored French hoods. Jane's IHS pendant, as seen here, is made of emeralds, which were thought to detect and protect the wearer from treachery. The emeralds therefore seem fitting when one considers that Jane was not strongly associated with any political faction or religious group. That Holbein produced many portraits of Jane, including the mural portrait depicting her with Henry and his parents, likely reveals Henry's deep attachment to his wife, who died an untimely death after giving birth to Edward in 1537. The next portrait depicts Anne of Cleves, Henry's wife who he married after Jane. That Anne is depicted as facing forward and appears to be at ease is somewhat ironic. This portrait was painted before Anne's marriage to Henry, and she would have had no reason to fear Henry's dissatisfaction with her. However, Henry would feel none of the genuine affection that he felt for Jane, and their marriage was annulled within 8 months after the marriage. Not a happy ending for the smiling Anne. Her simple and reserved smile foreshadows the tendency to conceal the sadness that she faced throughout her time in England. She claimed that she was happy in letters to her family despite marital troubles, and remained in England until after Henry's death, despite the fact that she would never feel at home there. The smile also exudes the gentleness that Thomas Beacon noted in her. There has been some speculation as to how accurately Anne has been depicted in portraits. Individuals such as Sir Edward Wotton spoke highly of her beauty, yet Sir John Hutton famously said that he had heard no great praise neither of her personage nor beauty. Does this suggest that Anne's appearance contributed to Henry's inability to consummate his marriage to her? Henry implied as much himself, yet comments made by the French diplomat Charles de Marillac have been seen as implying that Anne was not any less attractive than Catherine Howard. Although Wotton claimed that Holbein's is a trustworthy depiction, we will be unable to know with certainty. One looking at this portrait would hardly suspect that there existed such controversy surrounding Anne's appearance. Although it is difficult to know for certain how accurately Holbein portrayed the physical traits of Henry and his wives, his portraits do seem to reflect the character of these individuals in a way that takes into account the social and political circumstances that shaped their lives.